Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. This is a video series, a set of podcasts, depending on how you consume it, where myself, Glenn Ford, a game designer and developer, chats to this guy, Mike Hutchinson, also a games developer and designer, about designing better miniatures games. So recently, Mike and I have gotten the chance to play some maybe slightly newer titles. We play fairly regularly, but I think often we're sort of delving through some of the archives a little bit.
Unfortunately, playtesting one of our new games, and
Or
so
yes,
those tend to be like half playing a game, half chewing on a game.
yeah. And recently, for whatever reason, we've happened to sort of hit up a few new titles, and they've caused us to sort of think about some subjects we maybe touched on previously before, and we decided to sort of go back and maybe run over them. So there might be a little bit of a series of conversations going on, sort of using some of these recent games as touchstones. And so for today's conversation, we recently played a game that had a fairly central sort of set of AI rules to it. And it sort of caused us to reconsider the conversation we had previously, which I'll try and link in the comments, about AI. And in that conversation, we alluded sort of slightly high-handedly to the ideas of target priority for game controlled pieces and pathfinding,
Hmm.
and suggested maybe we'd get back to it, and we never really,
Ladies and gentlemen, that time is now.
and that
Oh,
time has come because so the game we were playing had what I think is a fairly sort of reasonable first sort of route one version of some default sort of AI, that basically went along the lines of step one, attack um, attack enemy. What if you've got available that allows you to attack enemy? If not, then move towards nearest visible enemy. If not, move towards nearest non-visible enemy. And those don't sound like a mad sort of set of AI controls to put in. But what came up is that if you've got a barrier that your monster creature can't get past or see round,
hmm.
and the nearest person to them is just on the other side of that barrier, so they move towards the nearest enemy, they then stand there on the other side of that barrier while other guys at the far end of it sort of just step round, shoot them in the head, and step back again, and do that repeatedly. And meanwhile, your game controlled piece is just bumping into that wall, snuffling at the guy on the other side of it, going "Mrr, mrr, mrr," and looking like a bit of a buffoon.
And so this is because I think before we solve some of these problems, we should probably sketch them out. So I think this is like the central problem of a single dumb monster. And then you've got a problem that we were wrestling with the Hobgoblin solo rules that I wrote recently, and that Glenn made some suggestions on the targeting logic for, which is that if you've got a group of monsters, a sort of a similar equivalent dumb behavior is that they all just go for a single target, and they completely overkill it, or they basically just, they aren't a interesting spread threat. They're just like, whoever Jimmy that you've shoved in the front of the group of people is, everyone goes for Jimmy, and everyone else is absolutely fine, and there's no threat to them at all.
Absolutely, and inherently, yeah. If there is a place where players can channel your monster into, where it becomes helpless, then more monsters can just be funneled down the same thing to sort of derp a derp against a wall. While the fact that there's a large group of monsters in a little bundle around the wall dribbling doesn't make things more problematic or threatening for players.
That's
Um,
right.
and so there are a handful of ways to deal, I think, with this sort of general idea and this problem, and there are sort of overall game mechanic things I think you can do, and then there are things about twiddling and tweaking with the AI. And so hopefully we'll talk through some of those ideas and those possible solutions. So I think one of sort of starting sort of fairly big in relation to game mechanics. one of the ways you can do it, and you can do this in a couple of ways, is by basically getting the players to sort of solve the problem for you. So a large overarching way of
so this is if you have a semi-competitive or a competitive game with wandering monsters, for example.
Well, I say the large mechanical way of doing it is only give your players melee attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And then they instantly solve. You don't have to have AI that's good at pathfinding because you've got players who want to do the pathfinding, and then you figure out the way that the melee is a challenge and a risk, and make the monster big enough and powerful enough. And that's a way of just basically going, with this simple with a larger game mechanical change, you solve the AI problems for you because you just go, I'm not going to give you shooting, so there's no advantage to you like ambushing the monster and making it look like an idiot. You've got to run up to it. You can do this in various ways of just saying, look, okay, I'm going to make you come into the monster's house, as it were, and have to meet it on some sort of level ground. You can give the human players shooting, so long as you don't give them too many actions. So I think that's the thing we encountered recently, is that if you give humans like 3+ actions, they can step out from behind cover, shoot, and then step back into cover. If you give them 2 actions, it's like, okay, right, I can step out and shoot, and then I'm visible clearly because I've got to remain in the place where I was visible to shoot monster. And now I'm into a place of difficult decisions and risk and reward and all these sorts of things. Do I bait out one guy and then the other people stand behind him and like have reaction abilities? And just generally, you can fiddle with the larger game mechanics to make it so that you don't have to build complex, difficult, layered, stepped out AI. You can just go to the players, well, I'm going to use your eye to make my AI work better. I'm going to go, you've got to find the path around these things because you've got to engage with the monster in one way or another, rather than saying, okay, let's pit the human intelligence directly against my game's intelligence, which is always going to be like hard to make the game's intelligence win out on that one.
So like when writing Perilous Tales, like that is a solo game where the missions aren't always about killing the monsters, and the monsters, because they're like Dracula or the Swamp Thing or something, like they need to feel really threatening, and particularly in the case of like the big villain in each scenario, they want to feel like I want some kind of visceral sense of like, if I stand still or make bad decisions, this thing is going to come for me and deal with me. And so I guess one of the things about Perilous Tales is that every monster ended up being a monster of the week with some special effects that I could add. And so in some cases, it ended up like allowing me to experiment with ways of solving the AI problem using like the monster's a ghost and so ignores terrain, or like the monster can fly or teleport, or sort of different solutions like that. But they aren't very general purpose. And the general purpose thing ended up in Perilous Tales in its current beta state ended up being a sort of slightly more complicated, like you have to make a check to see what the situation is, and then it will make a decision about which thing to do, and then the target priority ended up being something that kind of got chewed on a fair amount as well, because even if you've got a simple way of moving, like, okay, the monster's a ghost and it can ignore all terrain, choosing targets intelligently so that they threaten the progression of your game state, or they frustrate the progression of your game state, I think is also super interesting. So a simple example of that is like, if you've got an objective driven system, like does the AI prioritize things based on their distance to objectives rather than their distance from the monster?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you sort of touched on a couple of things there. Another quick solution is let the AI cheat. If the players have to pathfind around things, just say the monsters can just walk through the walls. They can just cheat. They can just break the rules, and that's a really powerful way, I think, to make sort of game controlled pieces threatening and powerful to players, because
I mean, I found myself returning to that quite often, where it's like, in order to combat human intelligence with a sort of very simple rules-based intelligence, you you just have to put your thumb heavily on the scale of the machine and give them like twice as many units, or they hit on a lower dice roll or whatever it is, just so that the machine is more threatening because it's more threatening, not because it's cleverly outwitting you.
Yeah, I mean, it is an internal problem. It is a constant issue here, is that the human beings can see everything that the AI is about to do, and the human can exploit that knowledge. And it's
Right, and that's, I think that's something that you identified really early on as like the fundamental difference between a digital AI and a board game AI. Is the board game AI is absolutely transparent.
absolutely. And you it's incredibly hard to get the board game AI to actually outsmart a human being. In the same way, it would be incredibly hard to outsmart another human being if you told them everything you were about to do just before you did it. And so, giving the AI just cheats to sort of to up the difficulty level, I think is very important. So I think,
And so actually, whilst we're on that, and before we go to that second half, like the natural solution that's likely appearing in your mind, dear listener, is, well, we can obscure things using randomness. And so like a game like Kingdom Death will do that with a deck of cards. Like it's still transparent because there's only 18 cards and I know what is written on literally every one of them once I've been through the deck once, but I don't know in which order they're going to come out and blah blah blah. Or I've experimented with quite random targeting systems or movement systems where it's like, well, the monster might do A or B, and you pick, or if there's models within 6 inches, it randomly selects one of those models. And that, throwing that chaos wrench into the AI, at least provides some unpredictability, so I can't completely read what the machine is going to do and position exactly correctly every time.
yeah, but I think also at the same time you still have to like have a shape to that randomness. I think occasionally you come across,
Yeah, no, otherwise it's incredibly irritating and just frustrating.
and also it's like every now and again you come across AI that just because it's like fully random, sometimes just wanders in completely the wrong direction and does donuts in the middle of the table, or
Right, changes its mind
yeah,
and
leaves
essentially.
alone somebody who's like hanging by a thread to just go off and punch a wall or something. And so I think it's fine to have like, okay, here's like 3 threatening, powerful options for the AI. You can randomly choose between them, but don't be like roll a scatter dice and go random, number in that.
Right. Or in the case of the Hobgoblin AI, it's like, I can't remember the wording of the rule, but it's basically like, if there's a super obvious, completely easy charge, do that. And then we'll figure out, like, if that's not true, then we'll figure out something a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, so I think one of the other things we're sort of suggesting and alluding to just then is that ultimately one of the problems with a single piece of AI for all purposes is that you have to prioritize different things at different points when playing. That's what people do, and that's ideally when I think a good AI system probably wants 3 sort of possible different sets: a sort of pathfinding set of AI, an attack set of AI, and maybe depending on the game, a sort of objective driven set of AI. And you can sort of parcel these out between sort of different creatures and different monsters and be like, okay, well, this is the aggro monster, and this is the little behind the scenes guy who's going to fertle around and mess with the objectives while he's like punching your head in. But I think that separate pathfinding AI, I think, is a very sort of powerful thing, because when you have AI that says, okay, target a dude and go after that dude, it's super easy for a human being to stand that dude behind something impassable, and sort of exploit it and just go, where you can't get me. And the only way of getting to that guy is to go, okay, right, what if you just cannot find a sort of direct line, let's drop in some pathfinding AI, whether it's a full separate set or another set of if then statements to go. Because the issue with pathfinding is that fundamentally, that like there's the guy you're meant to be killing and there's you. If there's a wall here, then what you need to do is not prioritize him. You prioritize this random empty spot over here on the far end of the wall. You've got to suddenly have a quite like out of sequence priority where you go, suddenly the thing I most want to do is go and stand over in that empty space that has no like first order purpose for me, because its second order purpose is it has line of sight to the guy whose head I want to pull off. Um,
Yeah, and in A Billion Suns, I had a lovely get out of jail free for the solo rules for A Billion Suns, which are downloadable. Maybe I'll link all these things in the description. So because Billion Suns doesn't have a lot of line of sight blocking stuff, like I can't even remember. Maybe planets do, but maybe they don't. Like I was able to, because it's both an objective driven game and there's not a lot of line of sight worrying. Like I was able to use the first order problem to be the monster ship, the independent contractor, motors towards an objective. That's its first order problem. And then the next thing it does is it spins on the spot to face the nearest one of your ships. And so then it gets to attack you if it's in range. And so its second order problem is like, first I'm heading to the objective, and then I'll have a crack at you if I can see you and if I'm in range or whatever. And that was a nice easy solve in that game because I don't have to worry about bushes and buildings and stuff frustrating that threat.
yeah. So I think, yeah, stepping out some sort of pathfinding AI to have some way of going, okay, rather than directly trying to go towards an enemy or a creature, let's find some way of, you know, picking secondary sort of waypoints on your way towards the thing that you want to eat. Um, and identifying that. And there are various ways. So the tricky thing with writing that in an AI is essentially finding landmarks for the AI to sort of hook onto, because the point you want them to move into is something that is undefinable in many ways on paper. Um, and so you need to start considering things like objectives are really handy, table edges potentially, um, sort of groups of enemies rather than just the nearest enemy can often be a really handy one. I think sort of move towards the nearest enemy, if you cannot contact the nearest enemy, move towards the most enemies that you can, sort of prioritize ending near a group of them over ending nearest to the nearest one. Can mix things up, and you can sort of step that back out, and that sort of pulls the AI away from being sort of ambushable. And yeah, I think just sort of stepping out pathfinding things to say, like, okay, if there is no route between you and the nearest enemy, visible or not, let's switch over and go, right, instead, pick a table edge that you can move towards, without there being a barrier, and move towards that once, and then recheck your like kill priority list. And if you still can't kill, and it can be a fairly arbitrary thing, like moving towards the nearest table edge or moving to the visible
You,
table
you just
edge.
you just want to consistently break deadlocks in the AI.
Yeah, you just want it to be able to have a way of going, okay, well, let you are trapped here, let's just change the scenery for you, let's move you around, because eventually you'll come to a point where you will re-unlock and find your path towards them.
And there's a trick in video games here that is super reapplicable, which is to despawn the enemy. So, like, if it can't do anything in the AI deadlocks, an option is simply to remove it from the table, and because presumably there was a mechanism for spawning it, maybe it started on the table. But if there's a wandering monster like pops out of a hole or whatever, like just respawn it again and allow the monster to do all the cool things that it did the first time round.
And again, in many ways, that sort of tracks back to the idea of finding ways to encourage the players to pathfind their way into danger with the monster. Because if the monster can do nothing, it despawns, and then it gets its fat jump in sort of
It's an ambush attack or whatever.
ambush attack of doom, then players are like, we need to give it something. We need to sort of, keep Jason in sight, like during in the horror movie. Don't like lose track of him, because then he goes ambush, and then we're in real trouble. And so all those things where if you can re-encourage the players to keep the AI sort of active and moving by going, well, if you lose sight of the the killer in a slasher flick. You're not suddenly super safe. You're not like, oh great, I can't see Jason
Oh,
Voorhees.
this car must be a permanent state of bliss.
Absolutely, and just having the players go, no, for goodness sake, don't take your eyes off that lunatic. Get line of sight to him from a long distance away, maybe. Get line of sight to him in a way that's relatively safe, but don't just like all close our eyes, and wait for it to come for us. That's going to end very badly for us. Is both characterful and mechanically very powerful. So yeah, absolutely, sort of any way that you can get the players to take the weight off of the AI for you by pathfinding to it, I think is a really good idea. Stepping out pathfinding into a separate set of controls, and if you can do something clever with it where it actively like pathfinds intelligently, that's great. But if it just mixes up the situation when it's in its pathfinding mode, provided you sort of find a way where it's not going to repeatedly sort of get into a loop, I think is really handy.
I think there's a couple of things I wanted to mention here, which is in the last video about AI, we made it clear that in our opinion, asking the player to make a decision is a problem when it comes to running AI that is just easy to operate at the table. And so one of the obvious choices is like, well, if the monster can't directly move towards one of your models, like the player should find the shortest route to get to that model. And that's okay, except as you were demonstrating to me the other day, like when the shortest route isn't obvious, or there are two models and it could be moving towards either of them, and one of them's kind of obviously better or worse, like now you're in a position where you're in a sort of non-discrete set of options and the player has maybe 20 choices to choose from about how they pathfind, and now they're like, oh, I don't know what the game is asking me to do, or whether I should cheat on my behalf. And like you just get into this problem which we were talking about before, which is an AI that has player decisions in it is just a more frustrating machine to operate.
Absolutely, and I think it's the eternal thing where if you put the player in that position, they sit there and they have to go, okay, well, what was the writer's intention? Is the writer's intention that I should do things that are good for me, because that seems like a natural thing for a person to do, or is the writer's intention that I role play as the monster and try to be the smartest possible monster I can? And you can tell them which of those things you.
Yeah, Arkham Horror, the card game, has that lovely rule which says if there's something's unclear, just pick the one that's absolutely horrible for the players.
Absolutely, but obviously don't not tell them. Obviously tell them, just in case that happens, to be like, hey, look, I've tried to make this a really crunchy AI, so if you've got a choice to do something good for you, just do the thing that's good for you. It's all right that the AI can take it, or try and make the monster the smartest, bestest monster you possibly can, please, and let's all like agree to collaborate in this process. But don't leave it unsaid. Don't just be like, no, this AI is fine and it's never going to have a problem. You don't, do what best you think. But generally, yeah, I think try and absolutely avoid players having to make decisions for the AI, at all points. I think that's one of the defining features of good AI.
Yeah, and then what was the other thing I was going to say? No, it's popped out of my head. More AIs.
Yeah, I think the last sort of a closing comment I'd make is that players are meant to be smarter than the AI. Players are meant to be able to sort of set up ambushes and do cool things and outwit it, and they will be able to. That's not a problem. That's not an issue. The issue is when it's laughably easy to outwit the AI, and you outwit it in a way that makes it look just embarrassing and not a legitimate threat. If there's ways of setting up like ambushes for your AI, which requires a bit of finagling and organization and has a risk element to it, that's good. That's a good thing. That's fine. You can aim for that. The AI doesn't have to be smarter than the human. It just has to be sort of an interesting part of the puzzle for the human. Right. I think that was a relatively sort of insightful conversation about some of the more in-depth parts of AI, some of the issues as to why a super simple AI can go wrong and can sort of foul itself up a little bit. If you're struggling with an AI system in your own game, please do drop down into the comment section, sort of talk through what it is that you're having a problem with. Also, stop over to the Discord. There's lots of smart players who love to sort of twiddle around with these sorts of things. AI rules can be a lot of fun to design. They're quite sort of crunchy and puzzly, and it's the sort of thing I think game designers quite enjoy.
I think you're right.
While you're down in the comment section, obviously do give us a like and subscribe, hammer those buttons. It makes us very happy. But for now and from this conversation, I think it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye bye.
Bye bye.